Philosophy and its history are usually depicted in smaller or larger units, in terms of major systems and subsystems within, person-inspired movements or religion-based traditions, areas or branches, and sometimes in popular overview literature and certain philosophical discourses in terms of fundamental questions or concerns. Beyond doubt is in any case that philosophical thinking advances by integrating previous philosophical reflections, and it does so across language barriers. This makes it to a process in which qualities of tradition and continuation are equally inherent as phenomena of interpretation and translation. Hello, my name is Mikael Evdokimov. I am a university assistant at the Center for Translation Studies at the University of Vienna, and in this contribution I'm going to conceptualize the notion of philosophical tradition as a discontinuation framework, and I'm going to show how it is transmitted and transformed by translators of philosophy. The terms I will be using are semantically related. According to its Latin root, tradition signifies the act of handing over and delivering. Its proximity to translation, originally related to transferre, to convey from place to place, is striking. My purpose will be to attempt to dismantle and operationalize tradition by applying a yet further Latin root, namely continuare, meaning to carry on, to persist, to last, and its derivative continuere, to hang together. I am following up on the idea that it is in and through translation that philosophical tradition is unveiled, passed on, and transformed. Compare also translation scholar Anthony Pym's statement that translation becomes a condition of philosophy's own iterability, placing its legacy in foreign hands as carrying on a lost tradition. Several philosophers and philosophy scholars have reflected upon tradition in the context of philosophy, its history, and translation. Summaries of these reflections will be provided in the following, with the focus on how tradition is conceptualized and what functions are granted to translation. Eventually, the central determinants and features of tradition will be identified and framed in terms of discontinuation. Let's start with philosophy scholar Angelika Nuzzo and her claim that the history of philosophy can be conceived of as a translation process. Her central ideas are that no thinking is absolute, stand-alone or context-free. It is inevitably anchored in a tradition of thought, a tradition of language, thus tradition being conceptualized as linguistic, cultural, historical, context, and continuum. Translation in this theory is the initial principle of the intellectual history and becomes the mainstay of tradition's existence, revival, and evolution. Translation is conveying and rearranging the scope of references and concepts across traditions. Russian philosopher Andrei Smirnov, himself a translator of the Islamic philosophy into Russian, pursues the question of the definition of world philosophy. World philosophy, according to him, can possibly be constituted by philosophical continents represented by Europe, Islam, India, China, and Russia with their own traditions of thought and monolithic problem areas. Philosophical continents or traditions are further characterized in terms of culture-specific principles of meaning creation which impact thinkers and philosophers in the respective culture. Philosophy is described as a highly cohesive system, macrotext, or thesaurus of philosophical terminology. Consequently, the task of translation is the bridging of the hermeneutic otherness between philosophical continents and the unwrapping of the cohesiveness. Let me highlight the words that will serve us as clues for the intended overview of traditions, determinants, and features, and I will keep on doing so in the following slides. And please note that all translations from Russian and from German are mine. Three Anglophone authors point out at yet further dimensions of tradition. Alistair MacIntyre demonstrates that tradition entails an ethical dimension of values and beliefs attached to its linguistic appearance. His main concern is about the rootless modernity emancipated from tradition conceived as social, cultural, and linguistic particularity. Tradition is embodied in linguistic and behavioral forms which are dictated by the value and belief system of a community. People and institutions are bearing and engendering the tradition, yet they are initiated into it via language learning in the first place. Tradition reveals itself objectively or linguistically in the system of naming and classification, in the lexical polysemy, and in a referential set of authoritative texts. Translation is mentioned only marginally here, nevertheless it is admitted to be part of the history of linguistic and conceptual transformations within tradition. Similar conclusions can be drawn from Jonathan Rare's observations and what he terms as philosophical multilingualism. He considers philosophy to be significantly shaped by dialogicity, linguistic discord and diversity, as well as personal idiosyncrasies. Philosophical multilingualism is manifest in a rich semantic tradition behind each concept and a deep sediment of past linguistic interactions within the philosophical discourse. Philosophy is originally an ancient Greek word and the name of a tradition passed down to us through Latinized and Arabized forms and domesticated by English, German, and other national Ciceros across Europe. European philosophy, its language and vocabulary, are therefore creations of translation. Last but not least, Andrew Benjamin, by analyzing Hegel's and Heidegger's different readings of Plato, accentuates the immanent, plural, and potentially conflictual interpretive inscriptions in or as tradition. He says, I quote, "A text cannot be interpreted outside of tradition. Indeed, the act of interpretation is the continuance of tradition. Tradition becomes therefore the generalized side of interpretive differential plurality. Tradition is defined here as multiple subject-bound acts or the cumulative legacy of interpretations, accompanied by translation itself an interpretation process." Let me now parallelize these insights on tradition by a few scholarly remarks on the translation of philosophy. In approaching the translation of philosophy, philosophy scholars speak of a systemic approach which entails factoring in text's conceptual and intertextual correlations. They speak of the imperative of knowing the history of philosophy and the text translation history, and recommend exploring the term's discursive values out of their intricate cross-references. In the same context, translation scholars mention the attachment of a domestic range of reference to the foreign text and creation of new interpretive possibilities, and make the observation that translated texts bear the history of their recompositions and the circumstances thereof. Drawing upon these varying perspectives on tradition and the remarks on the translation of philosophy, we can now distinguish a number of determinants which are suggested by the notion of tradition in the reported contexts. These determinants are socio-cultural imprints, intertextual references, problem areas, terminological systems, cross-lingual etymologies, and varying interpretations. For a heuristic model, I therefore suggest characterizing tradition in terms of socio-cultural and referential framing, epistemic and terminological coherence, etymological and interpretive history. I imagine these features as being present or manifest in and affecting the levels of philosophical subject, discourse, text, and concept. Note that the socio-cultural framing comprises such extra-linguistic factors as culture, biography, beliefs, etc., predominantly in reference to the philosophical subject, whereas epistemic is not confined to the epistemology as a branch of philosophy, but rather implies philosophy's general red threads in the sense of systems, movements, branches, and fundamental questions, as has been mentioned in the introduction, predominantly in reference to whole philosophical discourses. Now, in the subsequent step, finally, these features can be conceptualized as discontinuities. I imagine discontinuities to be something like strands in the fabric of tradition. And I speak of discontinuation because, needless to say, tradition suggests temporality and processuality, and its motion across time, languages and cultures cannot take place without change. As Angelika Nuzzo, with a reference to Dante, points out, translation is also a modality of change and transformation, and represents a dialectics of continuity and discontinuity. However, to oppose this binary structure, I suggest using also the term transcontinuation, especially for highlighting the transformative processes and phenomena taking place in the translation of philosophy, just in the sense of Walter Benjamin's Afterlife or Jacques Derrida's Trace. As a matter of fact, discontinuation or transcontinuation is as much a metaphor as the words it substitutes in seeking to capture the complexity of philosophy's history and translation. My hope is that it will do so in a more nuanced way and possibly even provide a descriptive tool for philosophical translations. And in the following I will pick out one and exemplify how this framework can be applied and how translation and translators unveil and transform tradition represented by this framework. I will focus on the first and so far the only full translation of Martin Heidegger's Being and Time into Russian, accomplished by Vladimir Bibikhin in 1997. At this point I must admit that I have analyzed Bibikhin's 4-page afterword and have verified his remarks and comments in the translation itself only sporadically. Therefore, my conclusions apply to the afterword and its author in the first place, and any generalizations about the translation proper are to be taken with reservations. Providing introductory notes on Bibikhin will mean embedding him into a wider context of a culture, a society, or a tradition. For decades, Bibikhin worked and lectured at the Department of Philosophy at Lomonosov Moscow State University, authored a number of monographs on philological, philosophical and theological issues, and left a small body of selective philosophical translations. He was socialized within the Soviet and post-Soviet Russian philosophy and Orthodox Christian theology, and interestingly enough, he is sometimes honored in terms of tradition. For example, he is named the most prominent religious thinker of the New Russia, who continued the tradition of the Russian religious thinking of the early 20th century, or he is declared as belonging to the large European tradition, while at the same time remaining essentially a Russian thinker. According to a retrospective report on the reception of the Western philosophy in present-day Russia, 2 renditions of phenomenology in Russia can be distinguished, where Vladimir Bibikhin, among others, represents the Heideggerian one. Remarkable is that his affiliations to religious philosophical thinking and this one interpretation of phenomenology might have influenced his translation decisions and might be the cause of the controversies surrounding his translations. Particularly, his translation of Heidegger's Being and Time is criticized by Nelly Motroshilova as being a stand-alone phenomenon, his own piece of work. Whereas, according to Alexander Dugin, he even provides a hair-raisingly distorted image of Heidegger. More important and interesting is, however, that in his afterword there is referential evidence to his affiliations, and I will try to illustrate this. Bibikhin's 4-page afterword is mostly a commentary on numerous word choices, and it is interwoven with references that underpin these choices. Bibikhin starts with an extensive quote from Alexander Mikhailov, a Russian scholar of philology, culture and literature, and himself a translator of Heidegger. This first reference seems to testify to Bibikhin's and his fellow translators' translatological attitudes and provide a legitimization for the decisions he is going to share. This impression is reinforced as soon as he refers to the translation rules of Saint Cyril and Methodius, the inventors of the Cyrillic alphabet. Although there is no clue in the afterword on how exactly this is meant, it can be speculated that these credits were granted to the Paleoslavistic study by Yevgeny Vereshchagin on St. Cyril and Methodius' evangelical translations that assisted the formation of the first Slavic literary language. If this is correct, then the plea is made for rather literal translation principles. Bibichin backs up his word choices by applying a logic of precedence and refers to religious philosopher Vasily Rozanov's language use, Russian lexicographer and ethnographer Vladimir Dal's etymological explanations, and to Soviet-Georgian philosopher Merab Mamardashvili, in whose texts he finds the term присутствие, meaning presence, which he chooses as equivalent for the German Dasein. What is genuinely surprising in this context is that the final decision in favor of присутствие for Dasein was prompted by the words of an anonymous Orthodox priest about, I quote, bearing the truth not only by words, but by one's whole presence. Accordingly, these credits and references constitute the referential framing and transcontinuation in Bibichin's translation, and testify to his affiliations. They also help us to anticipate the terminological and etymological shifts, which I will now briefly touch upon. As has been mentioned, one etymologically justified decision is made with reference to Vladimir Dal. Another one is made quite on the literal basis of the verb formation for the word time, or Zeit in German and Время in Russian, because German zeitigen, meaning to bring forth or about, to result in, is translated as временить, meaning to delay, to temporize. This obvious novation is reasoned by Bibichin as basically the reverse side of the same incomplete process. Two more etymologically negotiated decisions concern the translation of möglich and Befindlichkeit. The crossed out words here indicate the dismissed alternatives. Finally, on the level of terminological system and transcontinuation, there are translations of conceptually correlated terms. Two or more cognates are translated with regard to their correlated word stems, or, if impossible, lose their connection in the Russian language text, as is the case with Dasein and erschließen, sich entschließen. It can be speculated at this point that one terminological remark in Bibichin's afterword preempts the direction of future phenomenological thinking among Russian philosophy scholars, because, despite of his translation inconsistency in case of Angst and Entsetzen, both translated as horror, ужас, he actually remarks in his afterword on the possible alternative of тревога, anxiety, for Angst, and this remark seems to directly influence the terminological preferences within the postulated new phenomenology of anxiety inspired by a speculative realism. Here we see textual material where the afterwards transcontinuation determinants themselves occur to be the basis for further reflections in the domestic philosophical discourse and naturally provide effectual evidence for the assumed transcontinuation. In conclusion, it must be admitted that the arguments of this contribution will need further proof beyond paratextual and peritextual evidence. My attempt was to demonstrate that handing over and delivering a philosophical text entails conveying it across complex frames that carry it on and ensure its integrity, but is not uninterrupted. It is accompanied by the processes of recomposition and recohering. Tradition can be metaphorized as a torch run, which represents the continuity of cognition. Against this background, translation will symbolize the transition points where the torch is being passed on, whereas translators, philosophers, will perform as torchbearers, whose socialization, ideological, academic, and philosophical backgrounds, as well as personal idiosyncrasies, are impacting and directing the complex transcontinuation taking place in the translation as its channel, trigger, or catalyst. Thank you very much for your attention.